So today is Tisha B'Av. It's a day that, it's a feast festival. It's actually a festival, even though it's a day of sadness, that if you were to ask anyone in the church, they wouldn't even know what today is. They would have never heard of it. The church knows of Passover, and most of them know about Yom Kippur, at least have heard of it, but nobody really knows anything about it. So Tisha B'Av, Yom Kippur, and Passover are the 3 days that Christianity supposedly is all represented in. Yet the church knows nothing about them. So today is the day. It's a feast of mourning. So being a feast is kind of weird, but it's a feast. It's a national day of mourning for the Jewish people. It's the end of the 3 weeks, the end of the 9 days. This is when the first temple and second temple were destroyed. And then, as I've done in other videos, there's been terrible things that have happened throughout history to the Jewish people, including things from the beginning of World War I to the beginning of the Holocaust. All kinds of things have happened on Tisha B'Av. So it's a day of mourning. But the church happens to think that everything in Judaism is sad, mourning, it's oppressive. Yet it's also a day of great gladness. It's supposed to be a day of mourning, but it's a day of joy. So, a day of mourning and a day of joy. Why? We're mourning because the temple was destroyed. First temple and second temple. There's no longer a temple. So today we're supposed to read Lamentations. We're supposed to read things like the book of Job. You're supposed to be mourning. We've been in mourning for the past 3 weeks. Now, the church wouldn't understand mourning. They would think, oh, you're in Yeshua and you're freed and you're supposed to be full of joy. But again, it's a day of joy because without the destruction of the temple, we wouldn't be looking forward to the third temple, which is why it's also a day of joy, because you're to look forward to the third temple, which is the coming of the Mashiach, the Messiah. Again, everything Christianity is supposed to be revolved around. So what I find very interesting is the first holiday of the year is Pesach, Passover. Passover, which we know represents the sacrificial lamb and freedom from death. The very next holiday, which even though it's a minor holiday, it's still called a feast day in the Bible, as I said, is Tisha B'Av, which is a day of mourning, which is the destruction of the temple. And immediately from here, we move straight to Yom Kippur and the day of redemption. So I find that pretty fascinating. You have your lamb sacrificed, salvation from death, no more temple, then redemption, which is, like I said, prophetic to the third temple and the coming of Messiah, which is the ultimate redemption. So Pesach and Tisha B'Av always fall on the exact same day of the year, which again, in its own, is fascinating. So again, it's joy and redemption. It's followed immediately by, we're going to go right into Elul, which comes before Yom Kippur, which is one of the most fascinating times of the year, I think. If you go look into my studies on Elul, I think it's just completely fascinating. But that's all about repentance and teshuvah until we get to atonement. The Midrash teaches that the Messiah is actually born on Tisha B'Av. Now, it doesn't mean he's actually born. It just means this is, with the fall of the temple, that begins the act of the coming of bringing the Messiah. So the birth of the Messiah. So after the 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, or Yeshua's crucifixion, we have the destruction of the second temple. Hence, going from Mashiach ben Joseph to Mashiach ben David. That's the suffering Messiah and the king conquering Messiah. So let's look at the destruction of the temple. Now this is how far off Christianity is from actually understanding the biblical text by its Jewish authors. So on Tisha B'Av, the temple is destroyed. Now the Zohar teaches that in heaven, God's actually creating the Paracot for the third temple. The Paracot is the curtain, the temple curtain. So we're taught that every year that there's no temple, every year that we still don't have a temple, it's as if we're the generation that destroyed the temple. We're the generation that ripped the Paracot. Now, with that said, when Jesus is crucified, Yeshua dies, there's the ripping of the Paracot in the temple from top to bottom. As where Christianity's totally off. So that represents in the Christian world that the separation between God and man has been removed, and men have access to God now because of Yeshua's crucifixion. Totally no, not at all. So, as I said, God is preparing a new Paracot. The Paracot, the curtain, the veil in the temple, and this is in all sages' writings, all Midrashic writings, everything in Judaism, and all rabbis can agree that the curtain is the actual clothing of God. God's Spirit is behind the curtain in the ark. So the curtain would be his clothing. So it's God's holy robe. This is a fact. Now clearly, as a Jewish custom, during mourning, if something tragic happens, a bad tragedy, like if your child dies, if your spouse dies, if something horrible happens, the custom of Jewish mourning is to actually grab your robe, your garment, and rip it from top to bottom. This is clearly laid out in Esther, in the book of Esther, with Mordecai. When Mordecai hears of the bad news of the decree to kill all the Jews, Mordecai goes out in the street, grabs the top of his robe, and rips it in mourning. This is the ripping of the veil. This is God ripping in mourning his robe because his son, Yeshua, was crucified. Plain and simple. All that other nonsense is nonsense. But it's because we're looking at it, trying to figure it out through a English version of a Bible without any understanding and complete separation of anything Jewish, because the church has completely removed anything Jewish, so you have no idea what's going on. And then we just run around, or y'all just run around saying, well, the curtain has been separated. Every preacher runs around saying now, well, the curtain and God and man have been separated. And it's all based off of a falsity of teaching. So, anyhow, as I said, it's a day of great joy. It's a day of dancing. We're going to dance with the Lord when he comes back. This is a day of sadness, but the sadness brings joy. That pretty much is a message throughout the entirety of the Bible. Bring us back to you, Adonai, and we shall return and renew our days of old. Lamentations 5:21. So as I said, Christianity has this narrative. It's just not a good narrative. It's highly offensive that Christianity teaches that anything that has to do with law is negative, it's bad, it's oppressive, it brings death. It's about rituals and sadness of being enslaved and not freedom, which is completely wrong. And I'll prove it by, if you look at Psalms 119, it's the longest Psalms that there is. It's, 172 verses, and it's broken at each separate 8 verses. Each verse is broken into 8 verses, and each 8 verse begins with the letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it goes through all 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, it's wrote by David. David was the 8th son. 8 is also the number of new beginnings. 8 is also the fat or the overabundance. 8 is a full cycle of sevens. So it's the completion of 7. 22 is the totality of creation and life. 22 being 22 verses in the alphabet is the whole Word of God. And 22 is also prophetic. 22 is the Lashon HaKodesh, which is the holy tongue. So if you read Psalms 119, the entirety of David's Psalms is, blessed are you who walk in the law, who keep the commandments, who are saved by your laws, who love doing your laws. Jewish people, unlike the church's teaching, and I'm not trying to be offensive, but unlike the church's teaching, maybe your ordinary Jewish observer that just goes to synagogue on the weekends, just like a Catholic that just goes because they have to go, yeah, they might be depressed and mourned and doing things out of ritual. But an observant Jew does these things out of love for God. They do it out of the love and will to keep God's Torah and commandments. It's a relationship. It's done out of kindness, not out of a decree because they have to. It's also not punishment. And as I said, if you read Psalms 119, David just goes on and on about how great it is to keep God's laws, how happy he is to live in God's law, how he's saved through living through God's laws. So just take a look at Psalms 119, the very first verse. Blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. Another version, how blessed and favored by God are those whose ways are blameless, who walk in the law, who are guided by the precepts and revealed will of the Lord. Blessed are those who keep his statutes and seek him with all their heart. They do no wrong, but follow his ways. You have laid down precepts that are to be fully obeyed. Oh, that my ways are steadfast in obeying your decrees, that I would not be put to shame when I consider all of your commands. I will praise you with an upright heart as I learn your righteous laws. I will obey your decree. Do not utterly forsake me. I seek you with all my heart. Do not let me stray from your commandments. Praise be to the Lord. Teach me your decrees. With my lips I recount all the laws that come from your mouth. I rejoice in following your statutes. I rejoice in the great riches. I meditate on your precepts. I delight in your decree. I will not neglect your word. And it goes on and on and on. And I can't read all of it. It's 176 verses. I can't read all that. But it just goes on and on and on and on about how great God's law is. So God's laws are not a terrible decree. And the church really has to stop preaching this. Jewish people will never, ever accept anything you say. Yeah, there's a few Jewish people that become Messianics, but most of Judaism is never going to listen to you if you keep putting out this kind of message. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with keeping the law. Can you be free from the law? Can you be under law? These are different discussions. But the fact is, even if you were freed from them and you still kept them, there's nothing wrong with that. God is not mad or going to punish you for keeping them. Again, it's done out of the spirit of love, which, the church always says, living under the law, do the ritual, blah, blah, blah. But the spirit of the law, yeah, it's all done in the spirit of the law. We just have this, the church has this way of teaching that anything doing with the law or Judaism is bad. And it's all really based off of the way we read Paul's writings. The church loves to say, that they take the New Testament narrative that God has broke down the separation wall, the partition that divides Jew and Gentile. But the church's narrative is actually putting this wall up when we say, everything you're doing is terrible and bad. You got to stop doing that. You need to come to Christianity and your law is just terrible and it's holding you down in slavery. That's not the right message. Anyway, I'm not trying to be chastising. I'm doing this out of love. I'm doing this out of care because we really need to reconnect. We need to redeem Judaism and Gentiles. We need to redeem Christianity and understand it to its Jewishness. And the only way to do this is to not be so separated. Judaism views Christianity as very hostile. Anyway, so hopefully you get a little something out of that. And you get a little better understanding of the customs of Judaism and the biblical narratives in the way they are in their context. So, shalom, and I'll see you next time.